first of all, thank you, everybody, and thank you for tuning in, and welcome to this session, Long Tail Stock, the fast track to lost profits. And the backdrop to really this session was some of the things that we've learnt in retail in recent weeks. We've heard a number of companies announce profit warnings, and the companies that we're well familiar with is organisations like Boohoo, ASOS, AO.com, and the Hut Group, all of which are probably quite surprising that they've announced their profit warnings following recent events. But what's probably less surprising, and probably but worth reminding ourselves, is some of the issues that surrounded the news stories that we've been recently learning of. We've seen freight rates increase. Typically, a 40-foot container coming from Shanghai has increased 17 times the rates that it was currently priced at in months gone by. In addition to that, it's well versed in the news right now. The international energy rates have more than doubled, according to Bloomberg, since January of this year, and this can continue to rise. And then in addition to that, we've also got situations where retailers can't actually accurately predict where their merchandise is going to arrive into their distribution centres. And supply chain networks are really facing some real challenges as a consequence of Brexit, of a throwback from COVID and displacement of containers, and the whole fact that the world seems to be reorganizing and since the COVID pandemic. And then to compound matters further, we find also there's a consumer shift. In fact, digital channels have seen a surge in growth as a natural consequence of COVID. And typically, direct commerce retailers are finding that they are really having to invest heavily in the omni-channel, and inevitably, this is incurring greater costs to the business. So you've got an interesting backdrop of many different factors culminating in profit warnings that retailers have been putting out. And so I wanted to introduce myself to you as traditionally I've been a trading director, and I spent the last 9 years as trading director for Studio Retail Group, formerly known as Findel PRC, and a business that's transformed and transitioned from a catalogue business and transformed into a pure play digital online business. And I'm hoping to share with you some of the learnings that I've had that I'm hoping may be able to help you today when you go back to your organizations. And in particular, I want to share some of my insights into managing the stock asset, because managing the stock asset in this situation, in the backdrop of these sorts of cost inflationary pressures, is potentially a way that we can mitigate any risk to profitability. And I want to focus in particular the characteristics of long. So let's go to the next slide. And on the slide 2, I want to share with you the Pareto. I want to introduce that concept, Pareto. We may be familiar with the Italian economist Pareto, but Pareto developed this economic principle that typically 80% of performance tends to come from 20% of asset. And this is probably a very true statement to share. Asset, whereby we could apply the Pareto principle that would suggest 80% of your total business performance is likely to be achieved from 20% of your assortment. And that's not necessarily a problem to any retailer in its own right. In fact, if we were to take a perspective on Amazon and look at the Amazon model, we could actually probably conclude that Amazon is actually, the Amazon model is based on exploiting the long tail of stock, as shown in the red in this particular slide. And in particular, if we then focus in on Amazon, the Amazon model is really Amazon offering an endless assortment. And Search Engine Guide found, in actual fact, that Amazon generates 57% of its sales from long tail searches. So in Amazon's perspective, having a long tail of performance, having a lot of products within the assortment, achieving relatively small sales, but because of them on mass, culminating to a very significant share of their total performance. And where Amazon, in actual fact, model works particularly well is the fact that Amazon is using third-party vendors to fulfill that stock. So that's not necessarily the case to many of the retailers and the retailers attending this conference today, where most retail models are actually not based on these principles. The long tail creates an interesting dilemma, because on the one side we realize that in digital businesses and catalog businesses, offering a customer choice and value are both strong drivers, not only to organic search, but to conversion of our customers. But on the other side of the other side of the situation, we have the commercial expectations of a business that dictate that the danger is that if we commit too much of our assets into stock and we then turn that stock very slowly into profit, then that creates a risk for the business. So now let's move forward to the next slide. And the next slide, slide 3, really touches on this as a double-ended dilemma. And this double-ended dilemma really exists in the long stock situation, where you have a situation whereby 80% of the performance comes from 20% of the assortment. The dilemma, in my experience, often arises where retailers, in actual fact, haven't invested 80% of their stock investment in the 20% of the products that are achieving 80% of their overall performance, and thereby creates the dilemma. And the dilemma typically then manifests itself at the top end, where we look at the top sellers of products, where these are often found out of stock, thereby missing the opportunity to sell and turn that sales into profit. But in addition to that, we've got the possibilities, strong possibilities of customer dissatisfaction. And then at the other stage of the product stock performance, you've got the situation of poor sellers, where those are actually then a situation where there's excess stock as a consequence, as opposed to shortfalls of stock. And inevitably, that stock will need to be cleared from the business at some point, creating gross margin erosion. And at the same time, whilst we're holding that stock, then inevitably holding that stock is tying up working capital. It's usually housed in warehousing space, which is tying up then operational resources and inevitably having a consequence on profit. So let's move forward to the next slide. Because quite often dealing with a problem, in my experience, is often put off. It's deferred. And the reason it's deferred is for multiple different reasons, but in actual fact, there's maybe cultural issues that make retailers uncomfortable with declaring that stock or acknowledging stock is actually unprofitable and or likely to achieve less profit than you would otherwise. Inevitably, it also means applying provisions to the stock. Inevitably, it requires markdown. And all of these require additional work and effort. And at the same time, as we put in that extra work and effort, we see our stock and our margins diminishing. So let's move forward to the next slide. And because what I've also found in my working experience is that too few retailers have an action plan. And without an action plan, the it becomes inefficient in its operational handling cost. It drains profit and working capital. And probably most importantly, from my perspective, is it restricts open to buy, OTB. And the restriction of open to buy essentially means that the pipeline of stock and the ability to refresh the stock is actually now impeded by the long tail of stock, which is festering in the retail warehouse. Let's move forward to the next slide. So the key question that I suppose I want to pose today in this session, and one that I'm going to talk about, the question that I posed for myself as well as a trading director at Studio Retail, is how efficiently are we using our assets? And as a trading director, the assets within my portfolio would have been stock, storage space, people, and working capital. Let's move forward to the next slide. And now I'm proposing that whatever we do, um, really any short-term actions with dealing with a long tail stock could actually help in the short term. It could actually help improve working capital, but it's less likely to actually improve profitability. And so it's not the total solution in just literally marking down the stock. You have to have a long-term solution. You have to have a long-term and sustainable plan if you want to optimize the profit. So let's move forward to the next slide. Because now I want to talk to you about the some initiatives or some lessons that, through my experience, I picked up as a trading director on dealing with long tail stock. And one of the things that I'm a real advocate of in dealing with this situation is PLM, product lifecycle management, which means many different things to many different people. I often say if you spoke to 10 different merchants from retail organizations and asked them what their definition of lifecycle management, product lifecycle management was, you're likely to get 10 different answers. And if you look at the theorists and you look at the academics on this subject, you will find a multitude of different aspects and introductions. But let me define and explain what I believe product lifecycle management is all about. And at its core, at its heart, really, is a concept where a product should have a predetermined life cycle or a lifespan. And what I've often found is that it's very common for a trading business, a trading department, to have introductory dates for new product launches. But what's less common is for those products to also have predetermined end of life dates as well. And a product lifecycle management system or processes, in my view, really hinge on having a really good, strong disciplines on a plan for the merchandise. And so by having a plan, you need to start with a really strong product assortment plan, but you also need to have a very clear product strategy. And in addition to that, you need to then convert the product strategy and the product assortment plans into a merchandise financial plan. And part of that will start by having a PIM, a product information management system, which is really the foundation of product lifecycle management and requires you to have a very clear understanding of what your product hierarchies are and your product attributes are. And typically, in my experience of good practice, I'd be a strong advocate of making sure the attributes are surrounded around the customer. And so it would be very common in a product lifecycle approach within a PIM system to allocate product categories and product specific products, very clear attributes where they could be core range products, which may be products that will last be on sale, expected to be on sale for many, many seasons. Or alternatively, you could have seasonal products, spring, summer, or autumn, winter. You could have special occasion products, Christmas, Mother's Day, Father's Day, Easter, Halloween, etc. Or you could have special purchase products, products which are naturally just intended to be bought once and sell out within a very short period of time. But that would be the starting point for a PLM. Attributes behind the product. But to go beyond then the product life cycle management, you really need to start thinking about forecasting. And I wanted to share maybe a couple of ideas on some really good examples of organizations, in my view, that have made forecasting in a modern digital world very successful for them. And one of them would be the fashion retailer from China, Shein, spelt Shein. And you may be familiar with Shein as a brand because they've um, they've grown now to a 10 billion business, 10 billion US dollar business within a period of 9 years, based in China, but now represented in online in most countries across the developed world. And Shein have not only got a very well developed supply chain, but they've also got some really strong insights into the customer, and they use tools like Google Trend, but they also create communities of their own users on their own social platforms, and they take the temperature of the customer sentiment in order to help them forecast future demand, which is inevitably critical when you're trying to forecast the product performance within your portfolio. Another example I'd give you is the organization made.com, a really interesting online business headquartered in the UK, but also got sales achieved throughout mainland Europe. Combination of brick and mortar. They've got a few showrooms across Europe, but also a very strong online digital presence. And made.com have done something quite interesting insofar as they use a crowdsourcing approach with their own community of customers in order to forecast, but also place orders for their products. It's a situation which is made easier by the fact that a customer will tolerate longer lead times on furniture items, but it's a way that their technique that they've used effectively once again to help them forecast and predict the product demand for the future, because increasingly we're finding as retailers that looking backwards for our previous sales history is becoming less reliable as a source of prediction for our future performance. So PLM would be something that in order to try and find a sustainable long-term approach to managing our product and our merchandise and our long tail stock, then PLM would be techniques that I would strongly advocate. The second technique and lesson that I've certainly learned lots about in the last decade has been the sourcing strategy, and in particular digital marketplaces, because digital marketplaces is similar to the approach that Amazon took, but digital marketplaces are now representing very significant swathes of e-commerce sales. In fact, now nearly 60% of total e-commerce sales is coming from digital marketplaces. And recently, OC&C, the consultancy firm, did a study on where the growth has come from in e-commerce in the last 18 months, and recognised that the digital marketplace growth is where the lion's share of the growth is coming from. And many businesses can introduce some form of digital marketplace, whether it be, you may be familiar with the terms drop shipment or direct dispatch. Digital market, they're all forms of digital marketplaces, but digital marketplaces can be a great way for a retailer to take risk out of stock by introducing commercial partners, third-party relationships of suppliers who can fulfill the merchandise directly to the customer, but without the retailer or the operator of the marketplace losing control. And digital marketplaces, in my experience, can sit very comfortably within a retailer's own portfolio of product. And this is something that I introduced at Studio, taking the overall sales from a startup to 85 million within a 2-year period, through a digital marketplace platform that we introduced ourselves. And what we found in doing that, it was a great opportunity to start consolidating the stock portfolio. So the next lesson I'll share with you would be about liquid. Sure. The long tail stock is inevitably going to create pressure and consequences on the assets, specifically the stock asset. And liquidating that stock then will bring benefits. And in the short term, one of the strong benefits that's reducing selling prices in order to accelerate the sales and remove or reduce the levels of stock on long tail stock, it can drive customer traffic inevitably. And then in addition to that, it can clearly release cash. And those can be obviously very important benefits to a business in the short term. In the longer term, I would also be a very strong advocate of looking very clearly and very carefully at the assortment plan. And looking at the assortment plan something that took great bravery in our business was something that actually yielded great benefit. And we set out to reduce the stock by an arbitrary figure. And we weren't sure how much we could actually reduce the stock reduce the assortment, because clearly there's a grave danger if you reduce the assortment of your merchandise too much. The danger is your customer will actually, go elsewhere, and you now restrict the choice to an extent that's going to damage the business. But in particular, I'm talking about limiting the physical assortment of stock. And that's something that you can do if you combine your physical merchandise with a digital marketplace. So then you have a situation where you choose to hold some of the merchandise yourselves within your business, but at the same time, you continue to offer choice to your customer. But then the other part of the merchandise you could fulfill directly from your suppliers or your vendors, and have them deliver it direct to your supplier, to your customer, and that can offer great benefits to your business. So I would be a strong advocate of looking very carefully at your own physical assortment and planning to reduce that. And I took the figure of reducing it by 15% per annum, and looking along the way to see at the point which was the most sensible point to stop that reduction in the physical assortments plan. And I can share with you today that we looked at a product assortment at Studio there back in 2011 that had 40,000 SKUs that were kept in stock. And in 2019, that assortment had reduced to 18% of total stock holding, 18,000 SKUs. And it was a situation where direct dispatch or marketplace represented something like 25% of the overall sales. And the business at the time had grown over that period from 145 million turnover to over 330 million, and continues to grow very strongly to this day. So that would be an example of how you can physically reduce the amount of SKUs that you hold in stock, whilst at the same time continuing to offer the customer choice, but looking at how you've then used your sourcing in your assortment plan to choose how you source it, whether you use a digital marketplace platform or whether you choose to bring merchandise into stock. And once again, the digital marketplace platform can be an ideal ground to test how you actually use that stock in your business, and the success. It's a great opportunity to research and develop the performance of your product, which you subsequently can choose to buy direct, typically from the Far East, and bring into your own stock, your distribution centres, and fulfill it to your customers yourself. So the next point then I'd make is that if you do reduce the assortments, clearly businesses typically thrive and survive on growth. And so I would strongly advocate that there's no assumption or reduction in the sales expectation as a consequence of reducing the stock. I would also add from practical experience some of the different maybe symptoms or issues that you could find by identifying the long tail of stock that is likely to create pressures on your profits. And one of them would be merchants, the buying and the merchandising team, the trading team, buying minimum order quantities from their suppliers, from the suppliers of the organization. This is a real big red flag, and something that would be symptomatic of a long tail stock challenge, and also symptomatic of issues regarding the sourcing strategy. It suggests, in my view, that it's actually not working. And I've also put in a word of warning, really. It's for gamblers, not for retailers. Now, typically, again, I've seen symptomatic of a long tail stock problem is where you find that merchants are actually spreading their buying budgets quite evenly across the portfolio of merchandise. And if we revert back to the Pareto principles that says 80% of your product performance is most likely to come from 20% of your product, then you would also want to expect a balanced view that 80% of your stock investment should then also be apportioned to 20% of your products. And that's when we look at the situation where you've got merchants buying to minimum order quantities. There's a challenge there. And then the next point, the final point really I've got on this topic is the point regarding the phrase what gets measured gets attention. Because if we apply this phrase to this particular situation, um, again, I've found in experience that many retailers they'll look at the profit and loss account and they'll look at the balance sheet in isolation or separately. And I'm a very strong advocate, and something that I learnt a very hard lesson, but I took it on board and learnt from it, and that would be to look at asset utilization measures. And when I'm looking at asset utilization measures in this particular instance, I'm looking at the asset being the stock, and the average stock holding, which you can obviously turn into is turned into a financial number over any period of time, and look at during that, also look at the situation where how much profit contribution is it achieving over that period of time. And so changing the measurements that you use to measure your teams in a trading environment can also really help the long-term stock challenge. Let's move to the next slide. So I've got some final thoughts, and the final thoughts I wanted to leave you with today is that cost headwinds are there and in the background. They're very real, and essentially, it's really during this period, it's really essential that we look at our asset utilization and how efficiently we use the asset. So therefore, cutting the long tail of stock can not only form a short-term boost to sales, but unlikely to profits. It will therefore need a longer term solution. And looking at solutions like product lifecycle management, introducing digital marketplace platforms, looking at your assortment plan, how you measure it and how you manage it, and looking at the way your merchants are actually placing those orders and trading the sales performance within the business becomes super important. And so I'll leave you with the thought that there'll always be fluctuations in product performance, but if it's carefully managed, it doesn't necessarily need to drain profits, and it may, in actual fact, help develop profits. Um,